Okay, well, thank you all so much for having me here this evening. It's not every day I actually get to come and speak about my work locally, so I really appreciate the opportunity. It's also not every day I stand up without a script in hand. I thought maybe it was nicer for me not to tonight and to actually talk through some of the work I've done and some of the work I'm doing in a bit more of a casual manner rather than standing up and giving you a very formal academic presentation, which I'm sure would not be as exciting. So I'm an art historian. I don't actually make art myself. I study the work of others. Primarily, my research area is on the history of landscape painting around the Circumpolar North. So when I say Circumpolar North, I mean this region sort of highlighted in the darker blue. We here in the northeast of Scotland are geographically situated within the Circumpolar North. And this is really a way that I have been thinking around sort of a shared art history of the environment, especially in Scandinavia and Canada, which is my primary area of focus. To wind back a bit in time, I think it's important to give you a bit of an overview as to why I'm standing here as a British woman going to talk to you about Arctic landscape painting and Inuit printmaking, as I'm going to do today. I did my undergrad here in Aberdeen a good few years ago now. And I was fortunate to have as my supervisor, Peter Davidson, who wrote The Idea of North. And it very much informed my way of thinking around transnational art histories and thinking not about the national idiom within landscape, the tradition of landscape painting, but instead to think about these interconnected regions. And so this is very much something I took up in my PhD, which became a published book that came out last year. And the focus here was to take Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, and Canadian landscape art history that you might not think has much to do with each other, beyond the fact that they are situated around the Circumpolar North, but actually have a very strong rooted historiographical connection. So there was an exhibition in 1912 to 13 in which these artists, the Canadian artists, got to experience Scandinavian art across the border in the US. Famously, one of the group of seven, J.H. MacDonald, whose artwork of Lake O'Hara in the Canadian Rockies I've included here, remarked that it was kind of revelatory for them to experience art much like their own, to experience art that was of, to quote, that mystic north around which we all revolve. And this has really been a way in which Nordic and Canadian landscape painting has been assessed around the ideas of mysticism, around national identity, around the sublime, around these ideas of wilderness, of empty, depopulated landscapes that are there ready for human conquest and for extraction. So a lot of my work so far, and it sort of very much relates to what I do today, still has been on less so climate change and more so environmental history. So how might we use and how might we understand landscape painting as an example of environmental history? How might we actually look at the ways in which artists are depicting the land, what narratives they're choosing to construct, what narratives are being constructed around their artwork, and how might we also get into what is not shown? Now, obviously, artists have a great deal of agency. I'm saying that to a room presumably full of artists who very much are aware of the decisions they make in making a piece of art. And what I argue is that artists, in some instances, very intentionally excluded things and people and animals and industries from the landscape, whereas in other occasions, they were much more interested in the environment. They were not interested in the people. So Anna Bowberry, who I've spent a lot of my career so far working on, is the artist who painted this gorgeous Northern Lights painting on the left on the front of the book, and also this smaller glacial lake. She very much described herself as, she actually did describe herself as wanting to give an illusory glimpse of a polar researcher. And this is in the early 1900s when, especially in regards to glaciology, women were not really part of the world of glaciology. Glaciology had only recently in the last decade or so, sort of 1890s to early 1900s, formed as a separate discipline within the field of geology. But she really saw herself as trying to go to the Arctic. So she travels up to the Norwegian Arctic in 1901 and repeatedly returns over a 30-year period, producing works including this work of the Northern Lights, in which she comments on like the dance style of Loie Fuller. She's very much in tune with kind of the atmospheric scientific research that is taking place in the early 20th century regarding the study of the aurora borealis. She's also producing, this is a glacial lake, but she also produces several paintings of Norway's glaciers, both in the Jostedalen area in central Norway and also up into the Arctic Circle. And the reason I'm getting into this a little bit more about ice is because this is really what's going to underpin most of what I'm going to share with you today. I have made it a bit of a thing, whether intentionally or not, to closely study the depiction and experiences of ice, broadly construed, within Scandinavian and Canadian landscape art history. And it all started with this woman. And this has spawned what is now most of my work, which is collaborative efforts with glaciologists. So how do we come together across the humanities, arts and humanities, and the sciences, not in an attempt to use art to communicate climate change, so not art as a tool for scientific communication, but rather how might we actually use scientific language and a scientific discourse to help us as art historians understand what we're looking at, and actually how might we develop a vocabulary for describing what we're looking at. So these headlines are probably not news to you. I originally compiled these, as you can, I think, tell, in the start of the year. And I was not surprised, but perhaps slightly shocked to see the fascination that mainstream media has for sea ice. And I think when we think about the changing climate, we think, especially in the Arctic, we often think about sea ice levels and warming temperatures and rising sea levels. And sea ice is really caught up in this narrative. I was at an event in Oxford a few weeks ago where the geopolitical scholar Klaus Dodds very much took control of the room when he said, we are no longer at the point where an ice-free Arctic Ocean is something that's going to happen in 20, 30, 40 years' time. We are at the point where it's going to happen in 2030. That we are going to experience our first ice-free summer in the summer of 2030. And that is, there's no going back at this point. And while I find that shocking, and I find it obviously important for us to study, you know, there's a lot of work going into how we might refreeze water, how we might sort of artificially create sea ice. We're also deeply interested in what the lack of sea ice is opening up for us, especially around shipping routes. The ability to cross straight over the North Pole is going to speed things up considerably. And it's impossible to do this research without thinking geopolitically today. And really, it's hard to do it. I've done this research looking at the Arctic over the past century. If you're looking at anything to do with the North American Arctic, especially over the past century, you cannot not think about colonialism and geopolitics. But what I wanted to do with the current project that I'm leading is take this interest that I've had in glaciers and the ways in which artists have handled and engaged with glaciers from the mid-19th century through to the early 20th century, both as artists and as scientists, and actually think, well, what about the people that are living with this environment? What about the people that are actively being affected by the changes that are occurring? And so 3 years ago, while as a postdoc at the University of Toronto, I was very fortunate to cobble together what little money U of T paid me and go to the region of the village hamlet of Cape Dorset on the south of Baffin Island. So for those who might not be intimately familiar with the Canadian Arctic region, Toronto is sort of down here, way off the screen. And this is the region of Nunavut, and this is Baffin Island. And the community that I work with, and I still do the historical research, but most of my research nowadays is primarily focused on this community of Kenai, or Cape Dorset as it was formerly known, which is in itself an island community at the south of Baffin Island, sitting right on the Hudson Strait. And it's a community of 1,400 people, of around 100 of which identify as artists. So that is either printmakers, drawers, or carvers, or sculptors. And that's pretty astounding, I think, for a community of 1,400, for 100 to identify as artists. So in 1959, Alma and James Houston founded the West Baffin Cooperative and the Kinnite Studio in Kinnite. James Houston had been working for the Hudson Bay Company, as well as for several trade organizations in Canada, in the purchasing and acquisition of Inuit carvings throughout the Canadian Arctic for about a decade by the time he settled in Cape Dorset. And the opportunity to establish this art studio was really based off of Houston's own interests in printmaking and in carving. And he believed that you could take the skill of carving that had been very much sort of grown up in this community, as well as in other communities in the Canadian Arctic, and you could apply this to printmaking. And so I'll reorganize my slides, and now I'm not happy with it. So initially, he set about introducing printmaking through the use of serpentine stone blocks and soapstone stone blocks, which could be quarried locally and which were being quarried locally and used for carvings. And he thought they could be used for printmaking. You can see here a wonderful example of them actually trying to print. And the way it would work is you would carve the image in, and then once you'd done the print run of 50, you would then remove the image off the block, and you would keep working on the block until it was worn down. This is a rare example that somehow has ended up in the Tate. Then this obviously didn't work very well, so they resorted to slate. And for the past 67 years, they've been producing an annual print collection of prints, as well as drawings made in this community. So here you have a community with 67 years of experience in creating art that is engaging with their social cultural environment and with their surroundings. And so, having been in this community about 3 years ago with relation to a different project, I set about developing with the studios a project that would look at the ways in which artists in this community have depicted and handled the subject of sea ice in their work. And this came out of, as is always the way, I think, with academic projects, a frustration in a gap in existing scholarship, and that for 20 years, scientific research had taken place in this community and not once gone up the hill to speak to the artists. And so I felt, well, if we're going to do sea ice research in this community, we might want to bring in this unprecedented visual record that exists. And as with all art, there is subjectivity, but that's what's so important. And so for the last few minutes, I'll just walk you through. So this is a current project that I'm working on with the co-op and the studios and a hydrologist and glaciologist at Duke University. And we've been looking at the different moments in the sea ice season that have attracted artists. So for brief reference, the sea ice season used to run from around the start of August to the end of July. And that was very much still the case in the 1930s. Nowadays, the ice will harden and form in around December and last until about May. And again, think this is an island community that relies on the sea ice connecting them to the bigger island. So sea ice is important. It's not actually changing that much with climate change. The Hudson Strait means it stays pretty level, but what they're experiencing are these slushier moments, these longer to form moments in their sea ice season that are meaning that they become trapped on this island, unable to get to hunting grounds and unable to get to fishing areas. And so it makes sense that sea ice is a very important part of their work. Nikitai Samuali, for example, is really interested in the different moments of sea ice formation, whereas we see as well this depiction of the flow edge, this delineation of this space at which they can hunt for walrus, that they can harvest kelp. One of the things I'm currently working on is a paper in which I look at below the sea ice and the fascination that artists in this community have with the worlds that exist beneath the sea ice, especially with regards to seals and whales and kelp. There's a lot of kelp. And then there's this moment of breakup, this moment where breakup isn't this consistent ice breaks and it leaves the bay, but it rather flows in and out. And so it becomes really caught up in sort of the national psyche at this critical moment in sort of spring, early summer. Some artists are more intimately thinking about climate change in their work. This isn't necessarily the case for everyone. They are all intimately aware of climate change, but they're not all actively necessarily thinking with or about climate change in their work. But I couldn't obviously not feature this work by Tim Pitsiolak, who died about a decade ago, but who made several really important works, specifically focusing on the effects of warming waters and marine transportation on marine mammals, and very, very acutely aware of this sort of global notion of climate change. And so just to end, the way in which we're doing this work, and the reason I think, it's interesting as an art historian to be doing this work with artists and with scientists, is bringing these different ways of thinking together, this is the sort of where it does become a bit more sort of science communication, is how do we bring and understand these different forms of knowledge or data? How do we actually bring them together to understand and generate a more holistic picture of what is taking place in a community, what is important for a community? And how do we advance this research in a way that actually is benefiting and of interest to the artists that are part of it? So thank you very much.